Don't sign that. The voice cut clean through the polished air, steady and unshaking. And for a split second the entire boardroom seemed to forget how to breathe as Richard Caldwell's pen hovered just above the final page of a contract worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. The ticking wall clock suddenly loud enough to feel like pressure against the skin. 10 seconds to close a deal that would define the next decade of his empire. And yet every eye turned not to the lawyers, not to the executives in tailored suits, but to a young black waitress standing at the edge of the table with a silver tray still balanced in her hand, her posture straight despite the weight of attention pressing in from every direction. Her name tag catching the cold overhead light. Ava Brooks. Simple, unremarkable, easy to ignore until she stepped forward just 1 inch past where she was supposed to stand. Just enough to cross an invisible line no one like her was meant to cross. Caldwell let out a low laugh, sharp and dismissive, the kind that usually ended conversations before they began. "You're interrupting a billion-dollar closing," he said without even looking fully at her, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never needed to question himself. A few people around the table shifted, some amused, some uncomfortable, but no one spoke, because in rooms like this, silence belonged to power, and power belonged to him. Ava didn't flinch, her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, the faint clink of glass against metal echoing softer than the clock, but louder than her heartbeat. She set the tray down carefully beside a stack of documents, her movements controlled, deliberate, like someone who understood that one wrong motion would confirm every assumption already made about her. "Clause 14, subsection C," she said, her voice calm, not raised, not apologetic, just clear, and for a moment it sounded out of place, like truth spoken in a room designed for persuasion. Caldwell finally turned his head, slow, almost curious, his expression caught between irritation and disbelief. "Excuse me," he said, the words stretched thin with sarcasm, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as if the situation amused him more than it threatened him. Ava took one more step closer, the polished floor reflecting the overhead lights beneath her feet, her eyes locked not on Caldwell but on the document in front of him. "It doesn't protect your company," she continued, her tone unchanged. "It transfers every future liability to you, all of it." A quiet ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. One executive leaned forward slightly, another glanced toward the legal team. Victor Langley, seated across the table, didn't move at all, his posture relaxed, his hands folded, but there was a stillness in him now that hadn't been there before. Caldwell let out a sharper laugh this time, louder, as if to push the moment back into something manageable. "And you caught that while refilling water glasses?" he said, finally turning fully toward her, his eyes narrowing with a mix of disbelief and condescension. "Do you even understand what you're looking at?" The question hung in the air, not really a question, more a reminder of where she stood and where she didn't belong. Ava didn't answer immediately. She reached forward instead, careful not to touch the document, just pointing, one precise motion, a single line buried deep within dense legal language, easy to miss unless you knew exactly what you were searching for. The clock ticked again, louder now, 5 seconds, 4, somewhere behind Caldwell, one of the junior lawyers leaned closer, his brow tightening as his eyes scanned the page, then paused, then moved back again, slower this time, as if something had caught and refused to let go. Caldwell noticed the shift, just barely, his confidence flickering for a fraction of a second before he masked it again. "We're done here," he said, his voice firmer, reaching for control, but the room didn't move. No one stood, no one spoke, because something had changed, subtle but irreversible, like a crack beneath a surface that had always seemed solid. The lawyer cleared his throat, quiet but enough. "Sir," he said carefully, and that single word carried more weight than anything spoken so far. Caldwell's pen remained suspended above the paper, unmoving now, the ticking clock stretching each second into something heavier. And for the first time since the meeting began, the man who controlled the room didn't speak, didn't sign, didn't even blink, because the certainty he had walked in with was no longer certain at all. The lawyer's finger stopped halfway down the page, as if it had hit something solid, something invisible but undeniable. And the air in the room shifted again, heavier this time, Like the pressure before a storm finally breaks, Richard Caldwell lowered his pen slowly, not dropping it, not committing, just pulling it back an inch as his eyes narrowed toward the exact line Ava had pointed to, his jaw tightening as he read. Then reread, the words no longer flowing as smoothly as they had seconds ago. The language that once felt routine, now coiling into something sharper, something that did not sit right. Victor Langley remained perfectly still across the table, his posture unchanged, but his gaze had sharpened, fixed not on the contract but on Ava, studying her with a quiet intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with calculation. One of the senior attorneys leaned in closer, adjusting his glasses as he traced the clause line by line, his lips pressing into a thin line as the realization began to take shape, subtle at first, then unmistakable. This clause, he said carefully, his voice low but carrying across the silent room. It shifts long-term liability exposure. He paused, glancing up at Caldwell, then back at the document, as if hoping he had misread it. Not just operational risk, but legal accountability tied to future disputes. The words landed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Caldwell's fingers tightened slightly around the pen, the polished wood creaking faintly under pressure. That is standard in some structures, Victor said smoothly, finally speaking, his tone calm, controlled, but just a fraction. Too quick, like someone stepping in before silence could turn dangerous. It ensures flexibility across jurisdictions, he added, his explanation clean, practiced, but the room did not relax, not this time. Because now the attention had shifted, not to the deal, not to the timeline, but to the possibility that something had been missed, something important. Ava stood where she was, not retreating, not advancing, her presence steady in a space that was beginning to feel unstable, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, no longer holding the tray, as if she had already stepped fully into a role she was never meant to occupy. Caldwell flipped the page back, then forward again, scanning faster now, his eyes moving with less certainty, the ticking clock behind him continuing its steady rhythm. No longer a countdown to success, but a reminder of how close he had come to sealing something irreversible. Explain it, he said abruptly, not looking at Ava, not yet, his voice directed at his legal team, but carrying an edge that had not been there before. One of the attorneys cleared his throat, hesitating for just a moment too long. If this interpretation is correct, he began, choosing each word carefully, then any post-agreement litigation, regardless of origin, would default to your firm's responsibility, including claims that would typically remain with the originating party. Caldwell's head lifted slightly, his gaze shifting toward Victor now, slower, more deliberate, the silence stretching between them. Victor offered a small, controlled smile, the kind that suggested confidence but did not quite reach his eyes. That is a very cautious reading, he replied, his tone still even, but there was a tightness beneath it now, something restrained, something measured. Caldwell did not respond immediately, his attention drifting back to the document, then to the lawyer, then finally, almost reluctantly, to Ava. She met his gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not defiant, just steady, as if the truth she had pointed out did not belong to her, but existed independently, waiting for someone to see it. You are saying this clause activates under delayed conditions, Caldwell said slowly, his voice quieter now, more controlled. Ava nodded once, a small, precise movement. It looks dormant, she said, her tone calm, but it triggers once certain thresholds are met, and by then, it is too late to reverse. The room absorbed her words in silence. No one interrupting, no one laughing this time, because the confidence that had filled the space earlier had begun to fracture, subtle cracks spreading beneath the surface. One of the junior analysts reached for a tablet, pulling up projections, cross-referencing terms, his movements quick but careful, as if afraid of confirming what was already becoming obvious. Caldwell leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking softly, his posture no longer relaxed but rigid, calculating, the pen now resting against the table instead of hovering above it. Untouched. Run the scenario, he said finally, his voice low, directed at the analyst. The man nodded, fingers moving across the screen, numbers shifting, models adjusting, and as the seconds passed, the tension in the room tightened further. The quiet hum of the building systems suddenly audible, the faint buzz of electricity behind the walls, the soft shuffle of paper as someone repositioned a document, small sounds that filled the growing silence. Then the analyst stopped, his hand freezing mid-motion, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but enough. Always enough. Caldwell did not ask what he meant. He already knew. The room knew. The weight of it settling in without needing to be spoken aloud. Because the deal that had seemed flawless minutes ago now stood exposed, not as an opportunity, but as a risk, carefully constructed, expertly hidden, and almost accepted without question. Caldwell's gaze shifted once more, this time fully to Ava, not dismissive, not mocking, but searching, as if trying to understand how someone he had overlooked entirely had seen what an entire team of professionals had not. And in that moment, the balance in the room shifted again, quietly, but completely. "Say it clearly," Caldwell said at last, his voice low but edged with something sharper now, something that did not ask for confirmation but demanded precision. And the room seemed to tighten around the words as every eye shifted back to Ava, no longer dismissing her, no longer amused, but waiting, measuring, recalibrating. Ava drew in a slow breath, steady, controlled, the kind that anchored her in place even as the weight of the room pressed down on her shoulders. "It is not just a liability clause," she said, her voice calm, each word deliberate. "It is structured to look standard, but the trigger conditions are layered across multiple sections. You would not see the full impact unless you read them together." She gestured lightly toward the document, not touching it, just indicating the path her eyes had followed earlier. Section 14 ties to compliance adjustments in Section 9, and that loops into dispute resolution in Section 21. Once those conditions activate, every unresolved claim shifts to your side. A quiet murmur rippled through the legal team, not loud, not chaotic, but enough to signal that what she was describing was not speculation, it was structure. Caldwell's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled movement, but the only sound in a room that had gone nearly silent. "And the timeline," he said, his gaze narrowing slightly. "When does this trigger?" Ava did not hesitate. "Not immediately," she replied. "That is why it is hidden. It activates after performance thresholds are met. Months, maybe a year, long enough that you would already be committed, long enough that reversing it would cost more than accepting it." The words settled slowly, like something heavy being placed carefully into the center of the table, impossible to ignore. Victor Langley leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression still composed, but the stillness around him had changed. It was no longer confidence, it was calculation. "You are making a very complex interpretation for someone who does not sit on this side of the table," he said, his tone polite, but carrying a subtle edge, a reminder of hierarchy, of roles, of who was supposed to speak and who was not. Ava turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. Not confrontational, not defensive, just direct. "The language is complex," she said, "but the intent is simple." A pause followed, brief but noticeable, as if the room itself needed a second to adjust to the clarity of that statement. Caldwell exhaled slowly through his nose, his attention shifting between Ava and the document in front of him, then to his legal team. "Verify it," he said, his voice firm again, but no longer dismissive. The attorneys moved quickly now, pages turning, tablets lighting up, quiet exchanges passing between them in low voices. One of them pulled up a cross-reference, aligning sections side by side. Another ran a risk projection model, their earlier confidence replaced by focused urgency. The ticking clock continued in the background, but it no longer marked the closing of a deal. It marked the unraveling of one. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his posture no longer relaxed, his elbows resting near the edge of the table as he watched the process unfold, waiting, measuring, calculating. The analyst who had spoken earlier adjusted his screen again, his fingers moving with increasing speed, then slowing, then stopping entirely, his eyes fixed, unmoving. "Sir," he said again this time with more certainty, though no less tension. Caldwell did not look at him immediately. His gaze remained on the document, then slowly lifted. "Say it," he said, and the analyst swallowed once before speaking. "If the conditions she described are correct, and they align with the projections, then within 12 to 18 months, your company would absorb all downstream liabilities, including those originating from their prior operations. He paused, just long enough for the weight of that statement to settle, potentially exceeding the value of the deal itself. The room did not react with noise. There was no outburst, no raised voices, just a deeper silence, heavier now, more absolute. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly as he did, his gaze shifting slowly across the table until it landed on Victor. The two men held eye contact for a moment that felt longer than it was. A silent exchange, measured, controlled, but charged with something unspoken. Victor's expression did not break, but the ease that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by something tighter, more guarded. "That is a worst-case projection," Victor said, his voice still smooth, but no longer effortless. "And projections can be adjusted." Caldwell did not respond immediately, his attention drifting back to Ava once more. And this time there was no trace of dismissal in his eyes, only scrutiny, curiosity, and something else beginning to form beneath the surface, something closer to recognition, as if the role she occupied in his mind had shifted entirely in the span of a few minutes. Ava stood exactly where she had been, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, as if nothing about this moment altered who she was, only what others now saw. And in that stillness, in that quiet certainty, the balance of the room continued to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, as the truth she had spoken settled into place and refused to move. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, subtle at first, like air pressure changing in a sealed room, and then Caldwell moved, just enough to signal that something had fundamentally changed, his hand sliding the contract a few inches away from him instead of toward him, a small motion that carried more weight than any words spoken so far. "We are not signing this," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with finality, and the statement settled across the table like a line that could not be crossed. Victor's smile held for a fraction of a second longer before it faded into something more neutral, more controlled. "That is a premature conclusion," he replied smoothly, though the ease in his tone no longer matched the tension in the room. "We have spent months structuring this agreement. It would be unwise to walk away based on a single interpretation." Caldwell did not look at him immediately. His gaze remained on the contract, then shifted slowly toward his legal team. "Is it a single interpretation?" he asked, his voice measured, and the senior attorney shook his head slightly. "No, sir," he said. "It is consistent across the cross-referenced sections." A pause followed, brief but decisive. Caldwell nodded once, then leaned back, his posture no longer that of a man closing a deal, but of one reevaluating everything. Victor exhaled quietly, folding his hands together on the table. "Then perhaps we revise the language," he said, adjusting course with practiced ease, clarify the terms, ensure mutual protection. But the room did not shift back toward agreement. Not this time. Because the foundation had already cracked, and everyone present could feel it. Caldwell's attention moved again, this time returning to Ava, standing at the edge of the table, still, composed, as if she had stepped into the center of something without ever intending to. "You said the trigger is delayed," he said, his tone no longer dismissive, no longer sharp, but deliberate. Ava nodded once. "Yes, it is designed to activate after performance benchmarks are met," she replied. "Once the deal appears successful, the risk shifts quietly, and by then it is embedded." Caldwell's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a pattern finally becomes clear. "And removing it now," he continued, his gaze flicking briefly toward the contract. "What does that do?" Ava paused. For the first time, not out of uncertainty, but to choose her words carefully. "It exposes the imbalance," she said. "If the clause is removed or rewritten, the other side carries the risk again, and that changes the entire structure of the deal." Victor's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled movement, but noticeable in the stillness. "Every agreement has risk," he said, his tone firmer now. "That is the nature of business." Caldwell finally turned fully toward him, his expression calm, but no longer neutral. "There is a difference between shared risk and concealed risk," he replied, and the distinction hung in the air, clear, undeniable. One of the analysts shifted in his seat, glancing between the two men, aware that the conversation had moved beyond technical details into something more fundamental, something about trust, about intent, about what had almost been accepted without question. Caldwell reached for the contract again, but this time not to sign it. His fingers flipping through the pages with a slower, more deliberate rhythm, as if seeing the document for the first time. Every line now suspect, every word carrying weight it did not have before. The ticking clock continued behind him, but no one looked at it anymore. The deadline had lost its power, replaced by something far more important, understanding. Ava remained where she was, her presence steady, grounded, as if the shifting dynamics of the room did not alter her position, only the way others now perceived it. Caldwell stopped turning pages and closed the contract softly, the sound final, contained. "We will review this independently," he said, his voice controlled, leaving no room for argument. Victor's expression tightened just slightly, the first visible crack in his composure. "Of course," he replied, though the word carried less certainty than before. Caldwell did not respond, his attention drifting once more to Ava. And this time there was something different in his gaze, not just recognition, not just curiosity, but a quiet acknowledgement that the balance in the room had shifted in a way that could not be undone. "How did you see it?" he asked, the question simple, but loaded with something deeper, something that reached beyond the contract itself. Ava held his gaze for a moment, then glanced briefly at the document before answering. "Because it was meant to be overlooked," she said softly, and in that answer, the room found a new kind of silence, not empty, not uncertain, but filled with the weight of what had almost happened and the clarity of what had been revealed just in time. No one spoke immediately after her answer, and the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy with the realization of how close everything had come to slipping past unnoticed. Caldwell's fingers rested lightly on the closed contract, not gripping it, not pushing it away, just holding it there, as if the weight of the decision still lingered in the paper itself. The room no longer felt like a place of certainty. It felt like a place of recalibration, of quiet correction. And in that shift, something else surfaced, something less comfortable than numbers or clauses, something human. Caldwell exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting for a brief moment away from the table, toward the tall glass windows lining the far wall, the city. Beyond, stretching out in sharp lines and distant movement, everything continuing as if nothing had happened inside this room. And yet everything here had changed. He turned back, his attention settling again on Ava. But now there was a pause before he spoke, a hesitation that had not existed before, as if he were choosing his words more carefully than he was used to. "You were not supposed to be part of this conversation," he said finally, his tone not accusatory, not dismissive, just factual. Ava did not respond immediately. Her posture remained steady, her expression calm, as if the statement did not surprise her, because it did not. She had known that from the moment she stepped forward. Caldwell continued, his voice quieter now. "And yet you saw something no one else did," he added, the words landing differently than anything he had said earlier, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement that carried its own weight. One of the executives shifted slightly in his seat, uncomfortable, not with her presence anymore, but with the contrast it revealed, the gap between assumption and reality. Victor remained silent now, his earlier confidence replaced by a more guarded stillness, his eyes moving between Caldwell and Ava, measuring, calculating what this shift might mean beyond the room. Caldwell's gaze did not leave Ava. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" he asked, the question simple, but layered with something deeper, something that reached beyond curiosity into understanding. Ava lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but in reflection, as if the answer was not just a fact but a path she had walked. "I studied for it," she said quietly, her voice steady. "A few years ago." A faint pause followed, not long, just enough to suggest that there was more behind those words than she was saying. Caldwell's expression shifted slightly, the first real crack in the certainty he had carried into the room. "Studied where?" he asked, and this time the question held no edge, only interest. Ava met his gaze again. "State University," she replied. "Pre-law?" The words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not dramatic, not shocking, but revealing. One of the attorneys blinked, almost involuntarily, as if recalibrating his understanding of the person standing across from him. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. "And now you are." He gestured lightly, not finishing the sentence. But the meaning was clear. Ava followed the gesture with her eyes for a brief second, then back to him. "Working," she said simply, no explanation, no justification, just the truth stated as it was, the simplicity of it carrying more impact than any detailed story could have. Caldwell's jaw tightened again, but not in frustration, in something closer to recognition, the kind that does not come easily, the kind that forces a shift in perspective. He glanced briefly at the legal team, then back at her. "You read the entire document," he said, not a question. Ava nodded once. "Yes," she replied. "It was left open earlier." Another small ripple moved through the room, not of doubt this time, but of realization, the idea that something so critical had been left unattended, even for a moment, even by accident. Caldwell sat back again, the movement slower now, more deliberate, as if each action carried weight he had not felt before. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of thought, of adjustment, of something settling into place. Victor shifted slightly in his seat, finally breaking his stillness. "This has become unnecessarily complicated," he said, his tone controlled, but firmer now, as if attempting to regain ground. "We can revisit the terms at a later time." But his words no longer carried the same influence they had earlier, because the dynamic had changed. The foundation beneath the conversation was no longer stable. Caldwell did not respond to him. His attention remained on Ava, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but clearer than it had been at any point before. "You understood what was at stake," he said, and Ava held his gaze. Without hesitation. "Yes," she answered, and in that single word there was no pride, no hesitation, just certainty. Caldwell nodded slowly, once, as if acknowledging something beyond the moment itself. Something about the person standing in front of him, something about the fact that the room he controlled had been altered not by power, not by authority, but by clarity, and in that realization, the tension that had filled the space earlier shifted again, not disappearing, but transforming into something else, something quieter, something deeper, something that would not be easily undone. The room did not return to its previous state. It settled into something quieter, something heavier, like dust after a sudden shift, and for a moment no one moved. Not because they were unsure what to do, but because the meaning of the moment had not fully finished unfolding. Caldwell's hand lifted slightly from the contract and then rested again, slower this time, as if even small movements now required intention. The sharp edge that had once defined his presence softened just enough to reveal something beneath it, something reflective. He looked at Ava again, not as an interruption, not as a disruption, but as a presence that had altered the course of everything without raising her voice. The overhead lights cast a pale reflection across the polished table, catching the faint outline of the contract, the stillness of the glasses, the quiet tension in every seated posture. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon light had shifted, softer now, the sun angled lower, stretching long shadows across the city below. And inside that same light brushed across Ava's name tag, a small detail, but visible, present, undeniable. Caldwell exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in release, as if letting go of something he had not realized he was holding on to. "You could have stayed silent," he said after a moment, his voice lower than before, not directed at the room, only at her. Ava did not answer immediately. Her gaze moved briefly to the contract, then back to him. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying no weight of pride, only truth. Caldwell nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and then he looked away for a second, toward the window again, toward the city that continued moving without pause, without knowing how close one decision had come to altering everything. The faint hum of the building systems filled the silence, steady, constant, grounding. One of the executives shifted in his chair, the soft sound of fabric against leather breaking the stillness for just a moment before it returned. Victor remained composed, but the stillness around him now felt different, less controlled, more contained, like a calculation still running behind a fixed expression. Caldwell turned back again, his posture no longer rigid, but grounded, deliberate. "Why did you not?" he began, then paused, adjusting the question. "Why did you choose to speak?" Ava's fingers moved slightly at her sides, a subtle shift, not nervous, not uncertain, just human. She took a small breath, not visible to most, but enough to steady her words. "Because it was wrong," she said, her voice calm, even, as if the answer required no further explanation, and for a moment that was enough. The simplicity of it cutting through everything else in the room. No strategy, no calculation, just clarity. Caldwell held her gaze, and something in his expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to be seen by those who were paying attention. Something closer to respect, not spoken, not declared, but present, the kind that does not come from position, but from recognition. The legal team had quieted, their earlier movements slowing as the immediate urgency passed, but their attention remained, not on the document anymore, but on the exchange unfolding in front of them, because it was no longer just about the contract. It was about something deeper, something that had been revealed in the process. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his hands now still. "There are people in this room who are paid to see what you saw," he said, not accusing, not dismissing, just stating a reality that now felt incomplete. Ava did not respond right away. Her eyes dropped briefly to the table, then lifted again, steady as before. "Sometimes people stop looking," she said quietly, and the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight. Not heavy, not sharp, but true. One of the attorneys looked down at his notes, not because there was anything left to review, but because the statement had landed closer than expected. Caldwell's gaze remained on Ava, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no tension in it, only focus, only thought. "And you did not," he said, more to himself than to her. Ava did not answer. She did not need to, because the answer was already there, in the way she stood, in the way she had spoken, in the way she had not stepped back even when she had every reason to. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, but it no longer measured anything urgent. It simply marked time moving forward, unchanged, unaffected by what had shifted in the room. Caldwell straightened slightly, his posture returning, but not to what it had been before. Something in it had adjusted, subtle, but permanent. He reached for the contract once more, not to sign, not to move it away, but to place it neatly in front of him, aligned, controlled, as if restoring order to something that had nearly slipped. Then his gaze lifted. Again, meeting Ava's one more time. And in that quiet exchange, without words, without acknowledgement spoken aloud, something settled between them, not equal in position, not equal in circumstance, but equal in understanding, and the room, for the first time since the interruption, felt still in a different way, not frozen, not tense, but aware, fully aware of what had just happened, and what it meant going forward. The shift became undeniable, not in a single moment, but in the way the room no longer resisted her presence, the way no one interrupted when Ava spoke, the way even silence seemed to make space for her now. Caldwell adjusted the position of the contract once more, aligning it with precise movements that reflected a mind recalibrating in real time. Then he looked up again, this time not at the document, not at his legal team, but directly at her. And when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something quieter but far more deliberate. "Walk me through it again," he said, not as a command, but as a request, and that distinction did not go unnoticed. Ava paused for a fraction of a second, not because she was unsure, but because the moment itself had shifted. She stepped closer to the table, not hesitating now, her hand hovering just above the page as she began. "The structure is layered," she said, her tone steady. "It looks like standard protection language, but the connection points are buried across separate sections. You have to read them together to see the full effect." She traced the sequence in the air with subtle motions, guiding attention without touching the paper. Section 14 defines liability conditions, but it references compliance triggers. In Section 9, those triggers connect to dispute clauses in Section 21, and once all three align, the responsibility shifts entirely. The legal team leaned in again, not out of doubt this time, but focus, following her logic step by step. One of the attorneys nodded slowly as he cross-checked the references, his earlier skepticism replaced by quiet agreement. Caldwell listened without interruption, his gaze fixed, absorbing every word, not questioning, not dismissing, just processing. Victor remained still, but the stillness had changed again. It was no longer calculated ease. It was containment, a controlled effort to maintain composure as the foundation beneath the deal continued to erode. And the delay, Caldwell said, picking up where she left off. That is intentional. Ava nodded. Yes, she replied. It ensures the agreement appears successful before the risk activates. By the time it becomes visible, it is already embedded in performance metrics and financial reporting. A faint exhale moved through one of the analysts, barely audible, but present, as if the full scope of the exposure had just settled in. Caldwell leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing not in doubt, but in recognition of strategy, of intent. It is designed to be invisible until it is too late, he said, and Ava met his gaze. Yes, she answered, and the clarity of that exchange removed any remaining uncertainty from the room. Caldwell's fingers tapped once against the table. A controlled, measured motion, then stilled again. And if we had signed, he continued, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Ava did not hesitate. You would have carried the consequences, she said. Not immediately, but fully. The words settled without resistance, because there was nothing left to challenge. The truth had already been established. Caldwell nodded once, slowly, then turned his attention briefly toward Victor, the look between them longer this time, more direct, not confrontational, but unmistakably aware. Victor held the gaze, his expression composed, but the effort behind it visible now, subtle, but present. This interpretation is thorough, Victor said after a moment, his tone measured, but interpretations can vary. Caldwell did not respond to the statement itself. Instead, his gaze returned to Ava, and when he spoke again, it was not about the clause, not about the deal, but about her. You saw all of this from a single read, he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. Ava paused briefly, then nodded. Yes, she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no embellishment, just fact. Caldwell studied her for a moment longer, as if recalibrating not just the situation, but his understanding of the person in front of him. Most people would have missed it, he said quietly. Ava's expression did not change. Most people were not looking for it, she answered, and again the simplicity of her words carried more weight than any complex explanation. The room absorbed that in silence, not uncomfortable, not tense, but aware, fully aware of the shift that had taken place. Caldwell straightened slightly, his posture settling into something balanced. No longer rigid authority, no longer reactive tension, but controlled clarity. He reached for the contract once more and slid it to the side, away from the center of the table, a final, physical confirmation of the decision already made. Then his gaze returned to Ava, steady, focused, and when he spoke, his voice carried no trace of the dismissal that had filled it earlier. You changed the outcome of this room, he said, and the statement did not sound like praise, it sounded like recognition. Ava did not respond immediately. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She simply stood where she was, grounded, unchanged, as if the weight of the moment did not belong to her alone, but to the truth she had pointed out. And in that stillness, in that quiet certainty, the room settled once more, not into tension, not into silence, but into understanding, the kind that does not fade when the conversation ends, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. The room did not return to business as usual. It shifted into something quieter, something more deliberate, as if every person present understood that what had just happened could not be undone or ignored. Caldwell remained still for a moment longer, his eyes resting on Ava with a focus that no longer carried authority alone, but something closer to reflection. Then he stood, not abruptly, not to assert dominance, but slowly, measured, the movement drawing attention without demanding it. Chairs shifted softly as a few others adjusted in response, but no one interrupted, no one filled the silence, because the moment did not need noise. It needed clarity. We will pause this meeting, Caldwell said, his voice calm, controlled. leaving no room for debate. And with that, the structure of the room changed again, no longer a negotiation, no longer a countdown, but a space reconsidering itself. Victor Langley remained seated for a second longer before rising as well, his expression composed, but the confidence that had once defined it now replaced with careful neutrality. He gave a slight nod, professional, contained. "We can reconvene once your team completes their review," he said, his tone even. Though the certainty beneath it had thinned, Caldwell did not respond immediately. His attention had already shifted away from the deal, from Victor, from the entire structure that had defined the room minutes ago, and instead returned fully to Ava, standing at the edge of the table, still grounded, still composed, as if she had never stepped outside of herself even when everything around her shifted. "Stay," Caldwell said, not loudly, not sharply, but clearly, and the word landed differently than anything he had said before, not as an order, but as a request that carried weight. Ava paused, just slightly, her eyes flicking toward the door where the rest of the staff would normally exit, then back to him, and for a brief moment the old boundary between where she belonged and where she stood resurfaced, visible but no longer solid. The legal team began gathering their materials slowly, not rushing, their movements quieter than before, more aware, as if the presence of something unexpected had altered even the way they handled paper and screens. One of the attorneys gave Ava a brief glance, not dismissive, not skeptical, but acknowledging, a small shift, but meaningful in a room that had once overlooked her entirely. Victor collected his folder with precise movements, closing it carefully before stepping away from the table, his posture still controlled, but his attention no longer anchored in the room, instead moving toward the door, toward an exit that had not been part of his expectation when he entered. As he passed Ava, his gaze met hers for the briefest moment, unreadable, measured, and then he continued without a word. The door closed softly behind him, leaving the room quieter than before, but not empty. Caldwell remained standing for another second, then moved slowly around the table, not toward the head of it, not toward his usual position, but toward where Ava stood, each step deliberate, not hurried, not hesitant, just intentional. The distance between them shortened, not dramatically, but enough to shift the dynamic once more. He stopped a few feet away, not too close, not distant, a space that allowed conversation without pressure. The late afternoon light now softer, casting a warmer tone across the room, touching the edge of the table, the curve of the chairs, the small details that had gone unnoticed before. Caldwell studied her for a moment, not evaluating, not measuring, but understanding. "You changed more than the outcome," he said quietly, his voice no longer carrying the authority of a command, but the weight of realization. Ava did not respond immediately. Her posture remained steady, her expression unchanged, not because she did not hear him, but because the moment did not require a response. Caldwell nodded once, as if acknowledging that silence, then continued. "You saw what others missed, and you spoke when it mattered," he added. The words simple, but different from anything he had said before, not transactional, not strategic, but human. Ava's gaze held his, calm, grounded, and when she spoke, her voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. "It was there," she said. "Someone just had to look." The simplicity of it settled into the space between them, not challenging, not defensive, just true. Caldwell exhaled quietly, a small release of something unspoken, and for a brief moment the distance between their positions, their roles, their worlds, felt less rigid, not erased, but understood differently. Behind them, the room remained still, the contract set aside, the chairs slightly shifted, the faint hum of the building continuing as it always had, but everything within that space had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would carry forward beyond this moment. Caldwell glanced briefly back at the table, then returned his attention to Ava, and in that quiet exchange, without needing to say more, the direction of what came next had already begun to take shape. The room did not rush to fill itself again. It remained still, as if holding on to the moment just a little longer, and in that stillness Ava stepped back, not dramatically, not as a retreat, but simply returning to the space she had originally occupied, the edge of the room where she had started, where she had been expected to remain unseen. unnoticed, the tray still resting where she had set it down earlier. A quiet reminder of the role she had walked in with. Caldwell watched the movement, not stopping her, not calling her forward again, just observing, his expression no longer guarded, no longer calculating, but thoughtful, as if the distance she created now carried meaning of its own. The late afternoon light had shifted further, soft gold stretching across the polished surface of the table, catching the faint reflection of the contract pushed aside, the chairs left slightly angled, the space marked by what had happened without needing to say it again. Ava reached for the tray, her fingers steady as she lifted it, the faint clink of glass returning, familiar, grounding, the sound that had once defined her presence in the room, but now carried something different, something that could not be reduced to service alone. She turned toward the door, her steps quiet, measured, each one unhurried, as if she was not leaving something behind, but simply moving forward. Caldwell did not speak immediately. He let the silence remain, let the moment settle fully, and then, just before she reached the door, his voice came, not loud, not commanding, but clear. "Ava," he said, and the single word carried more weight than any instruction he had given before. She paused, her hand resting lightly against the door handle, the metal cool beneath her fingers. She did not turn right away, just stood there for a second, as if allowing the sound of her name to settle. Then she turned, meeting his gaze once more, the distance between them now defined not by space, but by everything that had shifted in between. Caldwell held her gaze, steady, deliberate. "This does not end here," he said, and the words were not framed as an offer, not presented as an obligation. They were simply stated, open, unfinished. Ava did not respond immediately. Her eyes remained on him, calm, grounded, as they had been from the beginning, and for a moment the room seemed to wait, not for an answer, but for the understanding of what those words might mean. The legal team remained still in the background, no one interrupting, no one stepping in, because the conversation had moved beyond them, beyond contracts, beyond roles, into something quieter, something more human. Ava gave a small nod, not an agreement, not an acceptance, but an acknowledgement, the kind that recognizes a moment without defining it. Then she turned back toward the door, the handle pressing down softly as it opened, the hallway beyond filled with the softer light of evening, a contrast to the controlled brightness of the room behind her. She stepped through without hesitation, her silhouette briefly framed by the doorway before the door closed gently behind her, the sound soft, final, but not ending. Inside the room, Caldwell remained where he was, his gaze resting on the door for a moment longer, as if the space she had occupied still held something of her presence. Then he turned slowly back toward the table, the contract still set aside, untouched, a decision already made, but not the only one. He placed his hand lightly on the edge of the table, the polished surface cool beneath his palm, grounding, steady, and for the first time since the meeting began,